This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is from our Protecting Animals series, where we talk to animal advocates past and present about the work they do for animals. Now, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA does really good work supporting animal studies scholars. It organises a conference every 2 years, and it also does other things such as publicise funding opportunities, calls for papers, and just generally provides support and advice to animal studies scholars. So if you're into animals and you're into studies, you should think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, this episode of Knowing Animals is also brought to you by Animal Publics. Have you checked out the Animal Publics book series yet? Animal Publics is part of the University of Sydney Press. It's a little part of that press that focuses very specifically on animal issues. It's got some wonderful titles in there. And I recommend you think about Animal Publics as a publishing location for yourself, or perhaps if you want to buy books for your institution, it's also a good place because it's got a lot of really wonderful titles. That's Animal Publics, which is part of the University of Sydney Press. Okay, let's get down to business. Now, we're sitting here in the courtyard in the sun at the University of Sydney. It's a really beautiful day in Sydney town. It's sunny, not too warm. And we're actually sitting in the courtyard of the building that I was based in when I was writing my PhD. So it's quite a nostalgic feeling for me. Now, I'm joined, however, this week by an international guest. So this is someone who I wouldn't normally have the opportunity to interview. And I'm really thrilled that I was able to meet up with him. So my guest this week is Larry Carbone. Larry is US-based. He's a vet, but he's also worked as a laboratory animal technician for many years. Now, he's written extensively on animal welfare issues, including the book What Animals Want: Expertise and Advocacy in Laboratory Animal Welfare Policy. That book was published by Oxford University Press in 2004, and today we're going to talk more generally about Larry's experience working with animals in a laboratory setting, perhaps particularly with a focus on the United States. So welcome to the podcast, Larry.
Thank you, Siobhan.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about why you made the move from being a vet to working with animals in a research setting?
Oh, well, I guess first of all, I wouldn't say I moved from being a vet, but there's a whole population of veterinarians in animal research labs. Any place there are animals, pretty much there are veterinarians. So that is, for most of my life, what my practice has been. So my patients are mice and monkeys and fish, and my clients are not companion animal guardians or pet owners, but scientists who have animals for their laboratories. But why did I get involved in this line of work? I'll just give you a quick autobiography. When I was about 21 years old, had some history of working with animals, needed a job. I found a job as a caregiver in a research laboratory. And I thought, this is going to be very strange and awful. I had had friends who'd worked in laboratories before, and it did not sound good. But I started doing the work, decided I should go to veterinary college, become a vet, and realized all through that this was my vocation, was taking care of the animals in laboratories who really need people who know about animals, animal health, animal welfare in there working with them.
So, Larry, can you paint a bit of a picture for listeners who perhaps have never had the opportunity to see inside a research laboratory? They may have some notions about what goes on, but what's a day like in the life of someone with your role?
Oh, okay. That's a veterinarian in laboratories who's responsible for animal health and welfare. We do a lot of what we call herd health medicine. So on a campus that has many thousands of mice, we may never see most of those individual animals, but we're developing the programs to monitor their colonies for infections and for diseases, and advising the frontline staff how to take care of those. We do get involved if somebody's doing an experiment with animals, but the animals start getting sick or having problems, and we need to work with them to troubleshoot what's the problem. We do a lot of teaching and training if you're a scientist and you need to do procedures with animals, like collect a blood sample. The veterinarians and their coworkers are the ones who might train you how to do that. And a big part of the work, and the work I focused on, is that in most countries, when a scientist wants to use animals in her experiments, she first needs to get an ethics committee to review the work and eventually give her approval for that. And vets are very intimately involved in that, in advising the scientist on the most humane way to do the experiment, and then advising the committee on their opinion on whether this project should be approved as written or needs to be modified. So a lot of it is research planning and focusing on how animals are used.
So could you tell the listeners a little bit about the regulatory environment in which US-based animal researchers operate? What are their legal requirements? How does the ethics committee system work, that kind of thing?
Okay, so in most of the industrialized world, the systems are similar in terms of requiring some sort of ethics committee approval, some sort of involvement of veterinary professionals in looking at all of that. In the United States, we have some strange exemptions from our laws that always sound odd to Australians and to Europeans when they first start looking in detail. We have two main laws that cover laboratory animal welfare. One is called the Animal Welfare Act, and it excludes laboratory mice and rats and fish and frogs. And so in reality, it covers, I believe, well under 1% of the animals in laboratories. Our other main law says essentially that if you want to use government funding for animal experiments, you need to abide by animal welfare standards. So that excludes all of the private drug companies, small colleges, other situations where animals are in laboratories but not using government funding. So we have strange exclusions to our laws. The basics of how they work when they are covering the animals is that in order to get approval to use an animal, the project has to go through a research committee. The focus is on what we call the 3 R's of reduction. Can you use fewer animals than you were thinking you needed? Can you replace the animals with either tissue culture or cells or even human volunteers or patient data? Can you do something, computer simulations, to not have to experiment on animals in the first place? And then the part that most involves vets is, can you refine the work? Can you use experimental techniques that are going to hurt the animals less? Can you use pain medicines that will reduce the amount of pain you're causing? Can you house the animals in ways that better meet their needs and preferences? So all of that goes into planning for what the animal experiments are. There's also then on the backside of that, there are government inspections for that tiny fraction of animals covered by our Animal Welfare Act. But there's also in-house oversight. So part of my job as a vet would be to go to your laboratory and see, are you actually following what you said you were doing? Are you taking care of the animals the way you promised you would do? And are you meeting standards? And if not, do we need to bring that to the ethics committee for them to review? Do you get to still keep doing your project? Do you have sanctions you need to? So it's planning, it's oversight, it's training. All of that's involved in how the laws operate. But mostly it's self-regulation, that I am employed by the same university that the scientist is, and I go to her laboratory and evaluate how she's using her animals. So it's a very heavy requirement that scientists and veterinarians work together on these committees to oversee what the scientist who works down the hall from them is doing.
So, Larry, I'm wondering, how well do you think the system works for the animals? And I guess connected to that is, have you seen improvements over the time? How much more needs to be improved? Can it ever be really effective? Can you speak to that issue?
Yeah, I've been doing this since I was 20 years old, which is a very, very, very long time. And I've seen lots of improvements. I think some of the improvements are because there's an oversight system that wasn't in place when I was starting out in this work. I think the committee takes its work very seriously. My partner's always amazed when I come home and leak stories about the long discussion we had about a researcher who was mistreating 6 mice. And like, really, all these busy scientists on this committee are taking this that seriously, that they're going to really discuss 6 mice. And so I think that has led to a lot of improvements. But that's also in the backdrop of society is changing. So what counted as acceptable ways to treat animals 30 or 40 years ago, that has shifted. So I think whereas when I was starting in this work, there was a lot of resistance from scientists. How could you possibly make these rules, and you'll hamper my ability to do good science? Now a lot of the scientists I work with say, well, of course I want to be able to go home at the end of the day and talk about what I do and feel good about the work I do. And so, of course, I want to listen to you about what's going to be best practice for my animals. So I think there's really been a lot of improvement in how animals are treated in laboratories. Do I think there's a lot more need for improvement? I absolutely do. Big focus of mine is on pain. I think people are not good about recognizing when their animals are in pain, which means that we can too glibly say, okay, the animals look good. They look fine. I looked at them for a few seconds this morning and they looked fine, so I don't need to worry about pain they might be in. So I think we're good at convincing ourselves that the animals are not in pain even though they are. And I think we're good at convincing ourselves that our pain medicines are actually more potent than they are. And I think when we think about ourselves, you have a really bad headache, you have a really bad sports injury, whatever your pain is, well, you know that painkillers are not 100%. And so even though we have drugs that can help, they don't bring pain to zero. But in the laboratory setting, we often slip into talking as though pain medicines do bring pain to zero. And so I think for me, that's the next frontier, is to really make progress that we've started making towards improving pain management for animals in laboratories.
So, Larry, you're the first person that I've interviewed on this podcast who works at the front line of animal research. And I guess I'm assuming that there'll be some listeners, perhaps a lot of listeners, who are thinking that it is deeply unethical to not only cause animals to suffer, but also to kill them in the name of medical research or scientific research. The 3 R's, one of them is replace. Are we moving towards a world without animal research? Is that imaginable, conceivable? What do you think about that issue?
Well, I think it's conceivable. I think the trends now are both that there are lots of replacements in use, just if only for narrow self-interest in getting better data. A scientist would rather do things as much as possible in vitro, which is to say, in a petri dish versus in a live animal. At the same time, there's an increase in the numbers of animals being used because more mice and more zebrafish in particular seem to be used. So I think there's both a lot of reliance on non-animal methods as well as really ongoing use of animals as well. Do I think tide will change at some point? I sure hope so. I'll give you one quick example. If you were doing HIV research, it would all depend what's the research question you have and what system are you going to study. And so suppose you want to know what happens on the surface of a lymphocyte cell that allows the virus to attach to it. Mostly you want to do all that work in a petri dish using human cells that are the most susceptible to HIV viruses, and try to image and do biochemistry and find out what's on the surface of those cells where the virus attaches. If you want to do something on how do we develop preventive programs, well, you're probably going to work with human volunteers and try different education strategies. If you want to work on things like what triggers the immune system to react to a certain vaccine to try to block HIV infection, that's that sort of middle ground where probably people are going to want to use whole live animals with intact immune systems to answer questions that are a little too complex for what we can do in culture, but can't be done yet in people. So depending on what your research question is, drives what's the tool you're going to use as a researcher.
And do you observe people asking these deeper philosophical questions, such as, if it can only be done with an animal, should it be done at all? Is that part of the thinking, or is it more around the minimization, the improving enrichment, all that kind of stuff?
My sense with the regulatory systems we have in the United States and other countries, the oversight systems, is that for the most part, the committees that make these decisions about whether you can do this project or not are not really engaging with those questions. And for a number of reasons, they may look at this project and say, well, none of us are really HIV immunology experts. How could we possibly even have the knowledge to say this cannot be done except by using animals? Plus, most of the people who serve on these committees are people who essentially are in the paradigm of accepting that if the scientist and her peers are convinced animals are necessary, the committee's job is mostly to work on reducing harm versus actually getting to that root question of, is this an important question to ask? Is it important enough to harm animals? And so I think most committees in most countries dodge that. In Australia, there's a system that at least you're required to have some proportional representation of animal protectionists or animal rights groups, not so much strong animal rights groups, on your committee, so you might have more of a voice really getting at that basic question. In the United States, much less so.
So for people listening to this episode who perhaps, want to maybe be a positive force in the world for laboratory animals, what would you suggest? Is it about thinking about joining an ethics committee if they're in a country that permits it? Or is it about trying to push for the 3 Rs to be taken more seriously, or funding for alternatives? Or what do you think is a positive way forward?
Well, I always encourage folks who care about animals to try to figure out who in their area has an animal laboratory and contact them and say, I know you need some community representation. Would I be somebody you would consider? And I think for the most part, most institutions would shy away from somebody who comes across as too strongly pro-animal. So it's a door you might knock on and nobody's going to give you much of an answer. But it's certainly worth trying. I think having serious, committed people on a committee who may be quite skeptical about the animal research is so powerful, because the committee will listen to them. In my experience, and this is sort of soft observation, not hard sociological data, the committee is reluctant to consistently override their community representatives on the committee. If they have strong welfare concerns, they want to keep working on this project until it meets their standards. We recently not hired because it's a volunteer slot, a retired critical care nurse who'd worked in the human operating room and ICU for years to come and be part of our animal committee. And she's been really quite strong in saying, I'm just not ready to vote to approve this until I see this and this and this other safeguards in place for the animals. And the committee could always call a vote and just vote her down. But mostly they want to make sure that they have her assent before they go that route. They don't want to alienate somebody with that perspective. Certainly trying to do some political pressure to make sure there's funding to get research into alternatives is very helpful because, again, if scientists have an easier, cheaper, clearer way of getting data that does not require using animals, it's expensive, it's time-consuming, it requires ethics approvals, they will do it. But they'll only do it if they think that alternatives are actually going to get them important information.
Interesting. Well, Larry, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. In your case, I'm a little bit. I think your status is perhaps a little bit different to other people's, but nonetheless, I've got the protecting animals questions here that I hope are good for you to answer. If they're not, we can always adapt them a little bit.
Okay.
But at this point, I say, are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I'm ready. Yes. Start the timer.
Can you recall when you first started to think that there was something wrong or problematic about the relationship between human and non-human animals?
Yeah. So when I was a kid, I got I'd always been crazy about animals. I got the chance to do volunteer work, and then they hired me for pay at the zoo in Boston, where I grew up. And I think a lot of people who've worked in zoos go in thinking that this is this very unproblematic, what better place to be an animal than in a zoo where everyone loves you and everyone's taking care of you. And I did fairly quickly learn from my mentors there that there are a lot of trade-offs to being a zoo animal. An animal that wants to hide most of the day isn't a good exhibit animal, so there's pressure to have exhibits where animals can be seen more easily. There's all sorts of things, buying status animals that other zookeepers will think, oh, you've got one of those, that's really exciting, whether or not you have the right facilities for those. So even as a 15-year-old working with 25-year-olds who I thought walked on water, they were teaching me then that even for these zoo animals we all loved, there are trade-offs, and we need to be advocates for these animals against the administrators and all of this. So that's when it first started hitting me, just as a teenager working with really good people.
Interesting. Can you recall the first thing you did to try and bring about change for animals?
Well, one thing I tried to do again as a kid working at a zoo was to take my bike at lunchtime and go out and catch tadpoles to bring back to feed the turtles. And now the language we'd use is that I was trying to do something to enrich their lives of the turtles, obviously completely indifferent to whatever suffering and death the tadpoles were experiencing. But the idea that even as a kid, my job was to entertain, amuse, socialize with the animals in the zoo and try to make their lives a little bit better than living in a cage being stared at by zoo visitors. So yeah, that was, again, sort of as a 14, 15-year-old, what I was trying to do to make things a little better for the animals.
So if you had to name one animal advocate who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, obviously from these stories, the most logical person I have to nominate is Richard Farinato, who was my first boss. He ended up working for the Humane Society of the United States as their expert in captive animal welfare issues, but very much he was probably all of 10 years older than me, but I just so respected everything that came out of his mouth. And he was firm and serious that this is not okay for the animals, what you're talking about doing or what our bosses are talking about doing. So I've worked with so many good animal advocates and read the work and had the chance to meet so many of the important people in this field, but he very much stands out as the person who started me thinking about this.
So what's the most important thing animal advocates can do for animals?
Stop eating meat. Really, when we look globally, what's driving so much of our ecological problems that are affecting actual live animals, what's affecting welfare of animals on farms, certainly all of it is driven by the level of meat consumption that we have in our world that's only getting worse as more and more people are getting up to Australian and American incomes. So much, that's the first, it's the most important first thing. For people in my field of laboratory animal research, I think my first request is to try to be as mindful as possible what you're doing. If I could get more researchers to treat every animal experiment like they would this major life event they're about to embark on. So before they buy 30 more mice to start this new cancer experiment, to really put the kind of planning you'd put into your wedding or your bar mitzvah or whatever else, that this is I'll say sacred undertaking you're about to do to make these 30 animals suffer for your important science, but don't do it without full planning. Everything's in place so that when you do this experiment, you are going to come out with some important piece of information that could help.
Interesting. Well, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think people are always going to have enormous unbalanced power over animals. And so given that awesome responsibility, it's for all of us to treat just about everything we do from the perspective of what I do, what I eat, what I wear, what medicines I take, what experiments I do, what jobs I take, where I spend my volunteer time, where I spend my money, has effects on animals and on our world and our environment, and to be mindful, to be educated about that. Even for people who are trying to lessen their impact as vegans, to recognize that even growing vegan food clears land, addresses issues like what do I do about mice and rats getting into our food storage. So to always be mindful that everything we do does impact animals, and to make our decisions somehow factoring that in, even if it's not always the final determinant of what we do. So to be mindful and educated about how our different choices and actions affect animals.
Indeed. Well, Larry, what are you working on next?
What I'm working on next. So I am retired from the day-to-day working with animals in laboratories. So anything I'm working on now is essentially self-funded writing and reading. I have a lot more I want to do on the question of pain in laboratory animals. So I've got some articles that I'm working on trying to raise consciousness among researchers and veterinarians about how well do we actually recognize pain and how well do we actually manage it, with the take-home message probably that the big thing we need to do is to avoid causing harm in the first place. So that's what I'm working on. I'm trying to, despite my technical and technological illiteracy, get a website up and going so I can blog on some of these issues. But to step outside, I'm no longer part of a big institution, so I'm less guarded perhaps in what I can say about what happens to animals in laboratories. So will there be another book? Probably. It's a lot of work, but I think I need to write another book about what I know about animals in laboratories and what I believe about how we can make things better for them.
Well, I certainly think there'd be many people who'd be very interested to read a candid account, no holds bar. So for the moment, how can people find out more about your work?
Well, right now, I guess the best way to find out more about my work is to visit my website. And forgive me that it looks so clunky right now. I will make it prettier. But that's larrycarbone.com, which I think you can, LARRYCARBONE.com. And that will put pressure on me, too, to try to get some quality content posted so that I can keep writing. And again, I'm not interested in an expose. I'm not interested in whistleblowing. I just know a whole lot from the day-to-day of working with scientists and their animals. And I think I have a lot of information I need to share before I truly embrace retirement. And
Wonderful. Well, we look forward to that.
Thanks.
Well, Larry, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars and animal advocates about their work. Now, you can find us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can find me at SO_S. And you can also find us at Facebook at Knowing Animals. And don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.